Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Stricken, Aberdeenshire, where today we report on the Fourth Estate and the coronavirus crisis. How have the media reported on the greatest health crisis for a century on both sides of the Atlantic? Today we asked two top commentators, one from the left and one from the right, to give us their analysis of how the health crisis is being examined and what will the political fallout be when it's over. From the United Kingdom, we asked top Tory commentator Peter Oborne whether the onset of the crisis will affect a hitherto cosy relationship between the Johnson government and much of the written press. And from the United States, we asked Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges whether the strain of the crisis has already affected President Trump's re-election prospects and not for the better. But first to Glasgow and Tasmina with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Thank you, Alex. And here are some of your responses to last week's show, which featured former Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, Sir Harry Burns, an MP from the Faroe Islands, Christina Hafos, and the MP for Nahelan and Muir, Angus Brendan McNeill. I should add that the extended interview by Alex with Sir Harry Burns is available on Alex's Facebook page and on his YouTube channel. Catherine Victor says, "It's not rocket science. These successful countries have followed guidelines put down by people who know how to manage the circumstances. We need to get away from the Westminster advice pronto." Neil says, "Fascinating that the Faroe Islands testing capacity was originally developed for their fish farms." He then goes on to say, "I like the suggestion of a Tobin tax for public health." Kevin Judge says, "Brilliant, Alex. As a Scot in Singapore, I'm very proud of your dedication and sensible approach. I so wish we had independence and we could be like the Faroe Islands." David, however, says, "There are many folk more qualified, to be honest, and they all say that lockdown was not the way to go." And finally, Charmaine says, "This programme is vitally important to watch. I've 110% agreed with every guest on the show today."
The UK's press and wider media started from a position in early March of broad support for the Johnson government's handling of the crisis, but have become progressively more critical as the realisation has dawned that the UK is emerging as the worst-hit country in Europe. I asked Peter Oborne what is going on, how that's going to affect the press coverage, and eventually how will that impact on the public view of the outcome. Peter Oborne, the Johnson government came into this crisis with a pretty fair win from the press. They were newly re-elected. Most of the media in the UK, certainly the print media, are sympathetic anyway, but it hasn't turning out like an uncritical analysis of their performance. Why is that?
Well, the media is very well disposed towards Mr. Johnson, and it started out being so. And of course, we had the drama of Mr. Johnson's fight with death. And of course, quite rightly, people were very sympathetic and caught up in Mr. Johnson's illness. But at the same time, it's right and proper that the media should inspect and judge and expose any failings in the government response.
There were a couple of incidents which seemed to indicate something of a turning point in the media's attitude to the government's handling of the crisis in the UK. The first one occurred in mid-April, where first the Financial Times and then the Sunday Times, over the course of one weekend, subjected the government performance to some searching analysis. How crucial were these reports in terms of affecting the accent by which most of the media were covering the pandemic?
I think the Financial Times, and in particular the Sunday Times reports, were very important. The Sunday Times report was very kind of gave a lot of insight into the attitude of the government in the early days of the crisis. The revelation that Mr. Johnson had not attended the first 5 out of 5 meetings of COBRA, the emergency committee which coordinates responses to crises, did suggest that he didn't grip the crisis with anything like the energy which might be expected. And the other thing was, of course, that it came from Rupert Murdoch's Sunday Times. Now, the Sunday Times had been a subservient follower of the fortunes of the early months of the Johnson government and throughout the general election, when it took the Downing Street line without much question. And then under a new editor, Emma Tucker, suddenly it started to produce reports which questioned the government line and exposed things the government would rather not have seen the light of day. So that was in a significant moment when a pro-government paper moved to a much more detached position.
And how about the differing positions in the four nations of the United Kingdom and the inability of Mr Johnson to convince the Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish First Ministers to follow him in his change of slogan? Does the differing positions present oncoming difficulties for the Westminster government?
I was struck by the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, saying that she hadn't been consulted before Mr Johnson's speech on Sunday. I feel that was a difficulty, and that he needs to keep everybody on board. That includes his own cabinet. There was quite an arresting report from an anonymous cabinet minister saying that there was fury in cabinet, that they weren't consulted about the speech. Now, that is potential political trouble for the Prime Minister if his cabinet aren't being brought in on the decisions and then don't get to feel responsible for them. So the political handling of the last few days has been questionable, and the problems will emerge from that.
And how about parliamentary scrutiny? We've had socially distanced parliamentarians sitting in their places, but the appropriate distance apart at Westminster. Obviously a very sparsely attended House of Commons for obvious reasons. And we've had the social media questioning. Does that let you yearn for the days of the hurly-burly and the intense atmosphere? Is it very difficult for opposition to sustain an attack on the government when we're in that position?
I think that a lot of the British media and a lot of British politicians are rather old-fashioned. They don't understand that social media is where political communication now happens much more than in the newspapers or even the TV. And that means that actually the communications people in Downing Street who aren't born yesterday, I don't like them much, but they're not born yesterday, are focusing far more on Facebook than they would be on whatever the popular papers are saying. And so this is where the fortunes of the Prime Minister will rise and fall, much more than on whether he gets the right headline in a newspaper. You can launch in through social media anytime you like in the course of the day, and really the print and news media is close to irrelevant in quite a lot of the discussions which are going on.
And would you expect there to be inevitable casualties of at least printed editions of the major titles?
I think one of the effects of the coronavirus pandemic will be to accelerate history. And it will do so in all kinds of ways, which we still can't predict. One of them, I'm sure, is geopolitical. One of them is financial, but it will also accelerate existing trends in Fleet Street. As you know, Alex, I'm a journalist in my blood. I love print journalism. I love newspapers, and the thought of a world without them I abhor. But I tell you something, that there are bound to be mergers, and titles are bound to disappear, and it fills me with unhappiness.
You refer to geopolitical impact of such a pandemic. Give us an outline of what you think that effect will be.
Well, the most obvious and the gravest one is relations with China, which we've all seen for decades now, that the emerging world power challenging the US hegemon is China. I'm sure you've noticed too, there's been a wave of attacks on China from very senior places in the West. You've got Tory MPs in particular, but also I saw the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Raab, saying something. And then you see Trump, who seems to be launching a series of attacks on China. He did this, of course, in 2016 when he was being elected, but it's much stronger now and it's much more vicious.
And how about the domestic political scene? Will the revelation that the United Kingdom is likely to have the highest death rate in Europe impact on the public consciousness when we eventually pull through this health crisis? Will that have significant effects on how the public regard the government over the medium term?
I think it's not appropriate to go heavily into that at the moment. It's the right questions now are how you move forward. But if it turns out to be the case, and nobody wants any country to do badly, that Britain has made mistakes along the way, which have cost thousands or tens of thousands of lives, then of course there must be an accounting, not less really for purposes of political point scoring, but simply so that if a pandemic or when a pandemic happens again, we know why it was. What were the right things, decisions which were made, but what were the wrong ones? And so I do predict that there will be political consequences, but they're more to do with understanding what has been a very grave situation.
There's been some quite vigorous criticism that Boris Johnson didn't make his statement about the strategy out of the pandemic, out of the crisis, to Parliament, but chose instead to do a prime ministerial address on a Sunday night direct on television. Is that a substantial complaint, or are MPs merely bickering about not being given their place and status?
What should have happened is that Mr. Johnson should have come to Parliament on Monday. He should have set out his policy in the schematic way he did on Sunday night. At the same time, they would have published the documents giving the precise details. And then in the evening, on Monday evening, he should have addressed the nation directly. And I think they made that was an insult to Parliament, therefore an insult to parliamentary democracy. And of course, it's one of the reasons why cabinet ministers are reportedly feeling upset, because they were excluded too. In other words, making the announcement direct on TV on a Sunday night and not to Parliament, he has opened himself up to justified criticism.
Peter Oborne in London, thank you very much indeed.
And it's always a huge pleasure to talk to you, Alex.
Coming up after the break, we move across the Atlantic and consult with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges. Welcome back. In the UK, as we've heard, at the start of the crisis, much of the media were pretty supportive of the newly elected Johnson government. Over the Atlantic, much of the press were already critical of the Trump administration, and his handling of the crisis has amplified that criticism many times over. To analyse this, I turn to Chris Hedges, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author and Princeton academic. Chris, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thank you.
Chris, the President has clearly sought to deflect responsibility onto his predecessor administration for lack of preparations, onto the World Health Organization for miscalling the crisis as the President sees it, or indeed onto China for being the origin of the crisis. How successful has he been thus far in deflecting responsibility elsewhere?
With most of the country not successful at all, but within his base, while it has taken hits, it remains effective. You have these kind of astroturfed protests outside of state capitals. I live in New Jersey. We even had one in New Jersey. These are people, although not in New Jersey, who show up with weapons, demand a reopening. I think it's hard to underestimate the power of news outlets like Fox News, which peddle the kinds of conspiracy theories that Trump propagates out of the White House, and the anti-science sentiments, which, of course, cater to the Christian right, that perhaps a third of the country that doesn't believe in evolution and, thinks Trump he has 81% support among the evangelical movement. This is a non-reality-based movement, which is kind of impervious to news outlets that still remain rooted in verifiable fact.
Now, the death toll from this deadly virus thus far, the United States, is by some measure the highest in the world. But of course, per head of population, it is still, as we speak, running at half the level compared to United Kingdom or Italy or indeed France. Is there a feeling in the United States that they, as some sort of national shame in and above the tragedy of having such a high death toll relative to other countries?
I would again say among a majority of the population, 50 or 60% of the population, that's true. Now, the New York Times ran a story the other day about how Trump's support among the elderly, and it was high among the elderly, is eroding because, of course, the White House is through its rush to reopen the economy, which it knows will exacerbate the spread of corona and, of course, the death count that comes with it. There are signs that among the older supporters of Trump, they realize they're being sacrificed. I think I can't stress enough this massive chasm that has opened up in the United States between those who merge fact and opinion and those who still remain rooted in a universe where facts matter.
You've been pretty critical of the $1,200 payment, the so-called helicopter money, but many economists would argue that that at least has been a way of getting some cash into the hands of a population who, in many cases, are badly in need of any finance at all. What's been the basis of your doubts about this policy?
Because it's too meager. And $1,200, the average rent, that isn't going to cover your rent. Of course, we have now rent strikes throughout the country. In essence, they're de facto rent strikes because people can't afford to pay their rent. That money gets vacuumed up by credit card companies and is gone. Unemployment insurance has been extended, although many people can't access the system because it's antiquated. The systems crash. We're now projected unemployment rates 25-30% by this summer. So my criticism is that it's almost a symbolic gesture towards a population. I mean, if you've seen the pictures, the bread lines now in the United States stretch for miles. And as this situation continues, and I think because of the Trump inability to handle the pandemic, we are, and this, of course, most infectious disease experts are now saying this, we are just going to see wave after wave after wave, which will not only put more strain on an inadequate for-profit healthcare system, but have exacerbate the economic crisis that the United States is in. So if I have this right, in Britain, you pay employers, and then employers pay workers 80% of their wages. That's not what's happened here. So you have small business after small business that is now going bankrupt. Well, not even small businesses, major gym chains, Gold Gyms, for instance, they're all already declaring bankruptcy, and we've just begun. So it's a wholly inadequate response to the economic devastation that has been visited on the American working class and shows no sign of abating.
What has been the commentary or the press reaction to the latest assault on Obamacare and Medicare in the middle of a health crisis? Is that seen by some as a misstep too far from the Trump administration, or will that once again play to the president's political base?
Blocking entry into Obamacare means they don't have any health insurance at all. So just the callousness and the inability on the part of Donald Trump and the Republican Party to grasp what's happening, I think means there will inevitably be blowback in the terms of social unrest. How that will manifest itself, given the configurations of American society, I don't want to predict. It very well could manifest itself in a kind of extreme right-wing blowback. But that the system has betrayed the working class and the working poor was true before this pandemic. We're now seeing that system utterly shut its doors to people in deep distress, and that will have consequences. To what extent Trump's base can be penetrated by reality, I spent 2 years writing a book on the Christian right. I'm not completely convinced that it can. I think that the Christian right and these groups that engage in magical thinking essentially function in the same way that what anthropologists would call crisis cults, where the assault of the fact-based real world is just too much. So we're headed for very uncharted territory, and I think we must never forget that the United States is a deeply violent culture, where you have huge numbers of American citizens armed with essentially military-grade assault-style weapons. You can see them with Kalashnikovs or AR-14s or 15s standing on the steps of state houses in southern states in the last couple of weeks. So the dark pathologies of the United States are coming out. The pandemic is bringing them out with a vengeance, and where that's going to lead, I think it'd be very difficult to predict. The only thing I'd say is that it's probably not going to lead anywhere good.
But the national emergency, a health crisis of unprecedented proportions, but you would think within that a political opportunity for the Democratic Party to re-achieve ascendancy. Is there any prospect a figure like Governor Cuomo has got great praise for his daily press conferences? Is there any chance that a figure such as that might emerge to overtake the lower profile Vice President Biden?
Well, the Democrats have certainly selected probably the weakest candidate they could find in Joe Biden. There's all sorts of talk within the Democratic Party and wild scenarios running Hillary Clinton with Barack Obama as the vice president, or drafting Andrew Cuomo, but I don't think the Democrats know, how that would play out. It would have to be before the convention, or the convention on the second ballot would have to draft a candidate. I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, but that the Democratic Party is concerned is clear, with good reason. Biden is an extremely weak candidate against Trump.
Chris Hedges, you're known for quite a pessimistic and forceful analysis of the state of the American body politic. Is there anything you've seen in terms of response to this crisis at state level, perhaps, that gives you some cause for optimism, the way that people have rallied round to try and help their fellow human beings in this time of extremity?
Well, the state responses have varied depending on the state. So some states have not taken the pandemic seriously, especially in the Midwest. Other states, New Jersey, I live in one, although we have the second highest death rate in the country, and New York State, you mentioned Governor Cuomo, have. Of course, I mean, the heroism of the frontline workers, and not just the medical workers, but the food service. I mean, all of those people who actually keep a society functioning has been impressive. What has been distressing is the inability on the part of the government to ensure their safety, and the fact that they have a sustainable wage. There's heavy pressure on the part of corporations and the oligarchic elites to put human life on the altar of profit. They would just rather lose more citizens and infect more citizens than see this economic devastation continue. So the response of the United States, unlike Great Britain, there's been no coordination. And that's part of the problem. So if you have a state like New Jersey, where the schools are now closed for the rest of the year, and there are very strict guidelines about social distancing, and you have to wear a mask in public, but then you have states, South Dakota, Montana, Mississippi, everywhere else, or Georgia, where they're just opening for business, then you're just, in essence, creating new clusters, which means that this thing will be with us. This pandemic will be with us for months and months and months, with all of the attendant problems that come with it.
Chris Hedges from New Jersey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
In this week of the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, it's hardly surprising that the coronavirus crisis is often depicted in wartime terms. On that basis, neither administration in London or in Washington is having a good war. Initial plaudits for the Johnson administration are now but a fading memory as the UK government comes under ever greater scrutiny for its handling of the crisis. Meanwhile, the heat has reached such a fever pitch in Washington that President Trump has actually threatened to abandon his daily briefings as a result of press hostility. In reality, it is neither the UK government's faltering performance nor the American president's occasionally bizarre briefings that are responsible for the mounting chorus of criticism and the press sharpening their knives. What really matters is the mounting toll of the dead and the dying, with both the United States and the United Kingdom vying with each other to be the worst performer in international terms. There is no doubt that international comparisons look bad for both governments. Now both countries, to some degree, are engaged in loosening the lockdown restrictions without having in place a fully developed system for testing, for tracing, for isolating. For both administrations, this represents a massive gamble. It is not just the reputation of governments, but the reputation of entire countries that are likely to be governed by their performance during this global crisis. For both the United States and the United Kingdom, right now the transatlantic special relationship looks like one of failure. And so from Tasmina and me and the rest of the team, it's goodbye for now, stay safe, and we'll see you next week.